Hello and welcome to this Proms at Home event. Proms at Home is free, but we'd love to raise money for our two wonderful charities, Toynbee Hall and the North London Hospice. Please consider donating at the end of today's event. Now, let me introduce myself and this virtual walk. My name is Kate Webster and I coordinate the Heritage Walks for Proms at St Jude's, and some of you will also know me as the Friends coordinator. This walk is an updated and expanded version, now in two parts, of a walk that I led last year. You can follow both walks with a map and commentary, as well as on the PowerPoint if you would prefer. The idea started with some work done by the Hampstead Garden Suburb Archive Trust to analyse the census forms from the 1911 census. I'm particularly indebted to Janice Blackstaff, who did the detailed analysis of Hampstead Way and Williefield Way and shared some ideas for this walk last year. This first walk will focus on the area of the old suburb known as the Artisans Quarter and the first people who made their homes here. First, a few words about the 1911 census. This was nationally important. It was the first time forms were completed by the householders themselves. You can see your ancestors' forms online completed in their own handwriting. It also collected new data for government planning, which allowed inferences to be drawn about subjects such as infant mortality, fertility, and household crowding. The census also coincided with the women's suffrage campaign and was boycotted by some suffrage groups. More of that later. The 1911 census offers the only snapshot of the early suburb and its residents before the First World War. The suburb was still being built. The first land had been purchased from Eton College in 1906, and the Hampstead Garden Suburb Act was passed by Parliament in the same year. Raymond Unwin's plans were drawn up in 1905, although the layout was modified several times over the next few years. Building started in 1907 and good progress was made, but many roads were no more than lines on the map or were only partly built by early 1911. We start our virtual walk on Central Square. Central Square was always planned as the centrepiece of the suburb, but in 1911 looked very different today and was still a building site. The churches were both under construction. The institute was much smaller. Only the vicarage was finished. In fact, there were only 3 people living on Central Square at the time. The Reverend Basil Bourchier, the first vicar of St Jude's, rattled around in the 14-room vicarage with only one female general servant, a Mary Holland, for company, whilst the only other resident was Mr Nelson Edward Davis, the caretaker at the Institute, who lived in a 2-room flat. This picture from 1909 shows how the Institute would have looked at the time of the census. The facade that we see in the black and white photograph is hidden behind today's frontage. The appearance of Erskine Hill in 1911 was rather different to that of today. At the time of the census, the houses in Erskine Hill started here at the junction with Temple Fortune Hill. The houses between here and North Square were under construction but incomplete. The road also finished at the junction with Osmonds Hill. What does the sentence tell us about Erskine Hill in general terms? The houses were very new. Some had names, some had plot numbers, and others had only numbers. They were different on each side of the road, as the houses were built by different companies. All of the homes were rented. The average rent was 21 shillings and sixpence, i.e. about £1.05 in today's money. This sounds very little. even with its equivalent of £119 today being much less than rent on these properties now. However, in 1910, the average salary was £70 for men and £30 for women. That is per year. And that would have been for an average 55-hour working week. Of the 63 houses, 62 were occupied on census night. They were predominantly terraced houses in groups of 4. More than half were 3-bedroom cottages. The similarities in the housing size led to other similarities in terms of family makeup and socio-economic status. As in other roads in the Artisans Quarter, servants were very rare. Only 3 homes boasted a servant on census night. 80% of the households consisted of married couples, typically a male head of household as the main breadwinner, and a non-working mother with school-age children. Often these were fairly new or expanding family units. The exceptions were 3 widows, 1 widower, and 2 single men. Just over half of all the households, 55%, had a child under 16 years of age. The average family size was 1.87 children. There were very few old people. The average age of residents was 28.7 years. This was relatively young, but similar to many other roads in the suburb. Here we glimpse the first house, Fairly Hope, in Chatham Close, whose residents were later to become famous. In the census they were noteworthy because they refused to complete the census form as part of the boycott of the census organised by some of the women's suffrage groups. This was the Fairfield family. Their census form was completed by the census officer following a visit. He wrote on the form, "Enumerator informed by Mrs. Fairfield that she intended avoiding the census." He also wrote, "Fairfield approximately 30, married or widow." Initially, 2 females and 2 persons were recorded on the form, but it was later amended in red to 5 and 5 and annotated "Particulars based on a personal call at Fairly Hope and inserted by instruction of the Registrar General." It is probable that he spoke not to Mrs. Fairfield, who was born in 1853, but rather to Letty, on the right-hand side of the slide. Josephine Letitia Denny Fairfield was training to be a medic, and she was later to become the first ever female Chief Medical Officer for London. She was also a member of the Women's Social and Political Union, the suffragette movement founded by the Pankhursts, although she later resigned. She was also to become well known as a Fabian and a feminist. Her younger sister, on the left, was Cicely Fairfield, born in 1892 and known as Cissy. She was to become better known under her pen name of Rebecca West, but she had been involved with selling suffragette newspapers and in suffrage street protests since her very early teens. Just before Denman Drive, we reached number 34 Erskine Hill. This was the home of one of the most interesting habitants in the road. George Montagu Elwood describes himself on the census return as a book designer and employer. However, his skills were very much broader than this. He studied at Holloway School of Art and later in Paris, Berlin, Dresden and Vienna. His furniture designs won a gold medal in national competition at the South Kensington Museum, now the Victoria and Albert Museum. At the turn of the century, he was designing furniture in the Art Nouveau and arts and crafts styles, and his designs were exhibited at the 1900 Paris exhibition, with one winning a silver medal. From 1912 to 1914, he designed posters for London Transport, some of which are still available. Later, he was to write books and edit journals on drawing, design and related fields. He also exhibited as an artist, including at the Royal Academy. We now move to number 8, Denman Drive. Here we meet two women who both worked as lecturers for the Women's Labour League and other socialist groups. They were both committed to widening the franchise, but to men and women without any property qualification. They were also in favour of accurate completion of the census as a basis for future social provision. One of these women, Margaret Bonfield, was already prominent in socialist circles. For example, she was the first female delegate to the Trade Unions Congress, or TUC, representing the Shop Workers' Union. In the 1920s, she was to become prominent as the first female chair of the General Council of the TUC, and with two others became the first female Labour MP at the general election in 1923. In 1929, she became the first female cabinet minister and privy councillor as the Minister for Labour. As might be expected from the rents, many of the residents of Erskine Hill were already in professional and white-collar roles. However, about half of the householders might have been genuinely described as artisans, a worker in a skilled trade, especially one that requires making things by hand. There were also a number of less skilled roles, such as postal sorters. Several families had one or more working children in the house. Among these were the largest families in the road, where the unmarried adult children were still living at home and often working in artisan trades. For example, at number 41 was the Earthy family. They had 7 daughters, ranging in age from 25 to 11 years. The 5 older girls all worked, and the 2 youngest were still at school. Mr. Earthy was a pianoforte maker, and presumably the daughters who worked, mainly in dressmaking, would have been able to supplement the family income. Similarly, the Cooper family at 76 had 5 of their 7 adult children living with them. All were single females aged between 27 and 17 and in employment, variously as tie makers, machinists and telephonists. Mr. Cooper was a bricklayer and may well have been working on the building of the suburb. Meanwhile, the Frost family at 65 had 4 adult children at home, 3 males and 1 female, ranging in age from 28 to 18, and all worked as upholsterers like their father. As already mentioned, Erskine Hill finished at Osmonds Hill at this time. We now take a deviation to Coleridge Walk. Coleridge Walk was still being built at the time of the census, and almost 2/3 of the houses were unoccupied. So we now move on via Addison Way to the bottom of Hogarth Hill. We stop here to look at number 38 Hogarth Hill, which was the home of Edith Howe Martin and her husband Herbert Howe Martin. Edith was prominent in the women's suffrage movement and appears on the plinth of the recent Millicent Fawcett statue in Parliament Square, erected in 2018. She was one of the first suffragettes to be imprisoned in 1906 for trying to make a speech in the House of Commons, which was one of the first acts of suffragette militancy, and you can see her in the picture in her prison uniform. She left the WSPU and was the co-founder of the Women's Freedom League, or WFL. This was still a militant suffragette organisation, but only advocated non-violent illegal acts. As editor of The Vote, the WFL newspaper, she initiated disruption of the 1911 census. In order to boycott the census, to refuse all information about themselves and their households, we intend to do our best to make it unreliable and inaccurate. And the WSPU later joined the campaign. Number 28 did not complete the census form, but Edith wrote, "No votes for women, no information from women." Legislation without representation is slavery. The occupier of this house is not a person, only a woman. See decision of House of Lords Scottish Graduates case 1908. The enumerator inserted additional information in red by authorisation of the Registrar General, stating the following. Information received that this was an open house on census night. Herbert Howe Martin, spelt wrong. Head, approximately 40, married, scientific man. Mrs. Howe Martin, 6 female visitors. And just to explain, an open house accommodated women who were staying somewhere other than at home in order to avoid the census. Later in life, Edith Howe Martin was to become the first female member of Middlesex County Council in 1919, and she organised the first children's play centre in Hampstead Garden Suburb. She also became a campaigner for birth control and organised the 1927 World Population Conference. She died in Australia in 1954. This is the census form for Edith Howe Martin and her husband, with the slogans written on it, as you can see, and the additional annotations by the enumerator. We now pass through Wordsworth Walk. Like much of the area, it was obviously recently completed and occupied, and could alternatively have been called Honeymoon Walk, since an astonishing 50% of the households had been married 1 year or less according to their census forms. Interestingly, it also included the home of a woman who was opposed to the women's suffrage movement and worked for one of the organisations which opposed it. We now emerge via Twitton onto Willowfield Green. The site of today's Fellowship House was occupied by a much larger predecessor building, the HGS Social Club. And as you can see from the bottom photograph, this was destroyed by bombing in the Second World War. Charles Henshaw, the steward employed by Hampstead Garden Suburb Company, lived in the social club with his family. Willowfield Way as a whole had quite a mixture of styles and sizes of houses, but the small houses nearby were often inhabited by artisans or even less skilled working people. For example, the 5 3-roomed cottages in Osmonds Hill, then called Willowfield Cottages, had 2 householders who were compositors or printers, a museum attendant, a pianoforte maker and a contract gardener. This is a view of Willowfield Cottages today, although it is now part of Osmonds Hill. We now move into Osmonds Hill, where we find another spoilt census form at number 28. Details are given for the householder, a Mr. Bartram, but details for his wife, a female visitor, and the female servant are much sketchier. Doris Bertram was a committed suffragette and appears on the honour roll of suffragette prisoners. As you can see, she has overwritten the census form as follows: voteless women of household only prevented by illness from evading census, therefore have refused to give information to the occupier. One assumes that her husband must have been somewhat sympathetic to the cause, since he has not filled in the additional information which she has withheld. The residents of Osmonds Hill were again a mix of professionals, artisans and other workers, mainly skilled. Those working on the building of the suburb were very much in evidence, occupying about 1 in 6 of the houses. These range from Herbert Welsh, whose house we see here, who was one of the major architects, and he built Wordsworth Walk and Coleridge Walk, among other roads, as we have already seen. There were also bricklayers, other architects, architects' assistants and associated trades such as quantity surveyors, works managers and gardeners. Passing on to Hampstead Way, we now see the two foundation cottages at 140 and 142. These were the first two cottages to be completed and opened in the suburb in 1907. 142 has a plaque on the wall commemorating the visit of the Lord Mayor of London. 142 was also inhabited in 1911 by John Albert Ellard. He was a builder's foreman for the co-partnership tenants, one of the companies who were building in the Artisans Quarter. We are now in Osmonds Place. We won't be looking at specific homes here, but if you visit, it is well worth exploring to look at the variety of architectural details. Do not miss the ageing plaque on the first tree on the left-hand side of the road. The tree was planted by Henrietta Barnett in October 1907 to mark the opening of the first house in the suburb by the Lord Mayor of London. Osmonds Place was perhaps the road which had the highest proportion of artisans and truly working class people living in it at the time of the 1911 census. The houses are mainly small cottages. There were only a couple of professional roles represented, a female teacher and an engineer. There were a good number of white-collar roles, predominantly clerks, in a range of workplaces, but skilled artisan jobs were in a clear majority. Some were related to the building of the suburb, but there were many others, some of which have almost disappeared today, such as wood engraver, spectacle maker, wheelwright, bootmaker, optical glazier, carver of wooden frames, athletic woodworker, who was a maker of sporting bats, and as in many of the roads, there were a number of printers and compositors. Another notable feature of these households was that almost half had two wage earners, most frequently adult children in employment, sometimes a lodger, often working on the building of the suburb, or occasionally unmarried siblings living together. This is a strong indication that although aiming to be a suburb for all classes, rents, even of the smallest houses, were not affordable to all. Another strong similarity between the residents of Osmonds Place was that almost all of the heads of household had been born in the London area. This was also a feature of a number of other roads in the Artisans Quarter, but varied according to housing size and by implication cost of rent and income of the occupier. In 1911, the view to the back of Arcade House, completed in 1909, would have been much more open, interrupted only by the builder's yard. Photographs like this one from the period show that this was a repository for windows and other materials during the building of the suburb. There were also two farm cottages somewhere here, although the precise location is unknown, although maybe they could have been the building with the chimney in this picture. Number 1 Farm Cottages was occupied by Charles Sibley, whose census entry describes him as a horsekeeper, delivering builders' materials for Hampstead Garden suburb. He also had a wife and 3 children. There were also 3 additional residents, all boarders. 2 were labourers unloading building carts, and 1 was a carman transporting the builders' materials. Similarly, number 2 Farm Cottages housed 8 people. The householder, Arthur Abrahams, was also a horsekeeper, moving builders' materials for the suburb. The 2 boarders were carmen, again transporting builders' materials around the area. Our final stop is 2 Temple Fortune Farm, now 219 Hampstead Way, a 6-room house. This was another corner of census resistance. Miss Kelsall, the householder, wrote, "No vote, no census." The enumerator's note states that there were 6 suffragist overnight guests. Likewise, at 3 Temple Fortune Farm, now 221 Hampstead Way, lived Miss Jessie Wade. The form here appears to have been filled in by Beatrice Le Mesurier, who was a boarder and recorded her age as 25. She gives herself the occupation of Suffragette Unwaged Women's Freedom League. She also originally wrote unenfranchised in the final column, which refers to disabilities, but this was crossed out. No vote, no census is again written across the form. The enumerator has written in additional information in red ink. All information refused. Householder, Miss Wade, 40, ? He alters Beatrice's age to 30 and writes that normally 3 women resident. Open house for suffragettes, 8 additional women recorded, total occupancy 10. Miss Jessie Wade was later to come to prominence as the founder of the Cats Protection League and other animal charities. So, did the Artisans Quarter merit its name? So, to my question, did the Artisans Quarter merit its name? There were undoubtedly a good proportion of artisans in this very brief period before the start of the First World War, although it is also clear from the street directories of the time that there was quite a high turnover in the rented homes, and that this was higher in the Artisans Quarter than elsewhere. This may be a reflection of the relatively high rents, but also that some of the residents would have moved on as building of the suburb completed. In 1911 there were numerous households who had members employed directly in building the suburb or as employees of the company as gardeners, architects and so on. The dominant employment groups reflected the labour-intensive nature of many trades at the time, for example printing. Similarly, there was a variety of trades involved in high-quality furniture manufacture, such as marquetry, furniture glass cutting, wood carving, as well as more numerous upholsterers and stuffers. The frequency of piano ownership is also hinted at by a good number of pianoforte makers. Other employment reflected the changing nature of the area, for example underground train drivers and greasers from the depot at Golders Green. Others were clearly employed in central London as museum attendants, including at Madame Tussauds and at the law courts. One of the largest employers was the General Post Office. All roads in the Artisans Quarter seem to have had at least a scattering of sorters and other GPO employees. Administration was also labour-intensive at the time, and probably the largest single group of people were employed as clerks in a very wide variety of settings, from manufacturing, banking and insurance, and other service industries, as well as local and national government. All in all, this was very different to the national picture, where mining, farming and textiles were by far the biggest employment sectors in the 1911 census. Thank you for joining me. I hope that everyone will have learnt something about the suburb and the first residents of the Artisans Quarter. I hope that you might also wish to join me on the second walk, which will start off where this one finishes, and look at a wider range of roads and housing types as we follow Hampstead Way and turnings off it. Proms at Home event. You can find other events in this special Proms at Home season, including concerts, Lit Fest talks, family events and another self-guided heritage walk on our website. I hope that we will also get to meet you in person at next year's Proms Festival in June 2021. Please don't forget that we are raising money for Toynbee Hall and the North London Hospice, and if you'd like to donate, please go to our website and click on our virtual donation bucket. there is a link on this screen. Thank you very much and goodbye.